The morning mist clung to the palace gates as Marcus adjusted his ceremonial uniform for the third time. 23 years old, and barely 6 months into his role as a royal guard, he still felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The golden buttons on his red jacket gleamed in the early sunlight, and his black boots reflected the cobblestones beneath his feet. Marcus had dreamed of this position since childhood. Growing up in a small village outside the capital, he would listen to his grandfather's stories about the brave men who protected the royal family. His grandfather had served as a palace cook for 30 years and would describe the magnificent halls, the important ceremonies, and the honor that came with serving the crown. Those stories had planted a seed in young Marcus's heart that grew into an unshakable determination. The training had been brutal. Months of physical conditioning, learning protocol, studying the layout of every room, corridor, and secret passage in the palace. He memorized the faces of every staff member, every regular visitor, every person who had legitimate business within these walls. The instructors had been harsh but fair, pushing the recruits to their limits because they knew that one day lives might depend on their alertness and quick thinking. Now, standing at his assigned post near the East Gardens, Marcus felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. The palace was like a small city, with hundreds of staff members going about their daily duties. Gardeners tended to the elaborate flower beds. Maids hurried between buildings carrying fresh linens, and kitchen staff transported ingredients for the day's meals. Everyone had their place, their purpose, their routine. The royal family was currently away on a diplomatic mission to neighboring kingdoms, which meant the palace operated with a different rhythm. There were fewer formal ceremonies, less hustle and bustle, but the security remained just as tight. Marcus and his fellow guards maintained their vigilance, knowing that, even in the family's absence, the palace held treasures and secrets that required protection. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus noticed the usual morning activities beginning around him. The head gardener, Mr. Thompson, emerged from the greenhouse carrying a basket of freshly cut roses for the main hall. The elderly man had worked at the palace for over 40 years and always greeted Marcus with a friendly nod and a comment about the weather. "Beautiful morning." "Young Marcus," Mr. Thompson called out, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Perfect day for the roses to bloom. They seem to know when they're needed most." Marcus smiled back, appreciating these small moments of human connection in what could otherwise be a very formal and isolated job. The older staff members had taken him under their wing, understanding that being a royal guard, especially a young one, could be lonely. They shared stories, offered advice, and helped him feel part of the palace family. The East Gardens were Marcus's favorite assignment. Unlike the formal front gates where tourists gathered and diplomats arrived with great fanfare, this area was peaceful. It was where the royal family would take private walks, where staff members might steal a few minutes of fresh air during their breaks, and where the most beautiful flowers in the kingdom grew in carefully tended beds. From his position, Marcus could see the maze of hedges that had been planted 2 centuries ago, the fountain that sparkled in the center of the garden, and the small stone bench where, according to palace legend, a princess had once written love letters to a commoner. The bench had become something of a wishing spot for the staff, though few would admit to such superstitions. As the morning progressed, Marcus performed his routine checks. He walked the perimeter of his assigned area, tested the locks on garden gates, and made note of anything unusual in his daily report book. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. The most exciting thing that had happened all week was a family of rabbits that had somehow gotten past the outer fence and were now living quite comfortably among the vegetable gardens. Much to the cook's dismay, but as Marcus completed his 3rd patrol of the morning, something caught his eye near the old stone bench. A splash of color that hadn't been there before, something that didn't belong among the carefully arranged flowers and trimmed hedges. He moved closer, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt, ready to report any security concern. What he found would change everything. As Marcus approached the stone bench, he could see a small figure huddled against its base. A young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. Her blonde hair hung in tangled strands around her shoulders, and her simple blue dress was wrinkled and dirty. As if she had been sitting there for hours, Marcus felt his training kick in immediately. An unauthorized person in the palace grounds was a serious security breach. He should call for backup, escort the child to the security office, and begin the standard questioning procedure. But something about the girl's posture, the way her small shoulders shook with quiet sobs, made him pause. He knelt down slowly, making sure his movements were gentle and non-threatening. The girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes that were red from crying. Tears had carved clean tracks down her dirty cheeks, and she clutched something tightly in her small fist. "Hello there," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when talking to his young niece back home. "I'm Marcus." "What's your name?" The girl stared at him for a long moment, taking in his uniform, his kind face, and the badge that marked him as palace security. She seemed to be deciding whether she could trust him. Finally, she whispered, "Emma." "That's a beautiful name," Marcus replied, sitting down on the ground so he would be at her eye level rather than towering over her. "Emma, this is a private place, right? How did you get past the gates?" Emma's lower lip trembled, and fresh tears began to spill down her cheeks. She didn't answer his question, but instead held out her clenched fist toward him. Slowly, she opened her fingers to reveal a crumpled piece of paper. Worn soft from being handled repeatedly, Marcus took the note carefully, smoothing it out on his knee. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone under great distress, and the paper was stained with what looked like tears. "To whoever finds this," the note began, "I cannot take care of Emma anymore. She is a good girl, smart and kind, but I am dying and have no family left. I heard that people who work at the palace are good people, honest people. Please find someone to love her and give her the life I cannot. She deserves better than what I can give her now. Her favorite color is blue. She loves stories about princesses. And she can already read better than most children twice her age. Please don't let her end up in one of those terrible orphanages. I am leaving her in God's hands and yours." Sarah Mitchell Marcus felt his heart sink as he read the note. He looked at Emma, who was watching his face anxiously, as if trying to read his reaction to her story. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a child who had wandered into the palace grounds by accident. This was a little girl whose dying mother had deliberately brought her here, hoping against hope that someone would show mercy. "Emma," Marcus said gently, "where is your mother now?" The girl's face crumpled. She couldn't walk anymore. "She brought me here last night, when it was dark, and told me to sit on this bench until someone found me. She said the people here would help me because they serve the royal family, and the royal family helps people who need it." Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. The mother had clearly put enormous faith in the palace staff, believing that they would show compassion to her desperate situation. But Marcus knew the reality was more complicated. Palace security protocols were strict, and unauthorized persons, especially children, were typically handed over to local authorities immediately. "She kissed me goodbye and said she was going to watch over me from heaven," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said I should be brave and remember that she loves me very much." The full weight of the situation began to settle on Marcus's shoulders. This wasn't just a security matter anymore. This was a child who had quite possibly been orphaned overnight, left alone in the world with nothing but a note and the hope that strangers would show kindness. Marcus looked around the garden, knowing that he needed to make a decision quickly. Other guards would be making their rounds soon, and once this became an official incident, Emma would be swept into a system that might not have her best interests at heart. The note had specifically mentioned avoiding orphanages. Marcus had heard enough stories about those institutions to understand the mother's fear. But what could he do? He was just a junior guard with no authority to make decisions about abandoned children. The protocol was clear: secure the area, contact superiors, and let the proper authorities handle the situation. Yet as he looked at Emma's trusting face, Marcus found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories, about honor and duty, and about what it truly meant to serve and protect. Sometimes he realized the right thing to do wasn't found in any manual or protocol book. Marcus folded the note carefully and tucked it into his uniform pocket. He knew he had only minutes before the next security patrol would come through this area. His mind raced through the possibilities, each one seeming more complicated than the last. "Emma," he said, his voice steady, despite the turmoil in his chest, "I need you to stay here for just a moment. I'm going to help you, but I need to think about the best way to do it." The little girl nodded solemnly, her trust in him evident despite their brief acquaintance. Marcus stood and walked a few steps away, pulling out his radio. He stared at it for a long moment, knowing that once he made this call, there would be no going back. Emma would become case number something or other, processed through official channels that cared more about procedures than people. Instead, he clipped the radio back to his belt without using it. He had made his choice. Marcus returned to Emma and sat down beside her on the stone bench. "Emma, I'm going to help you, but I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" She nodded, her blue eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel the full weight of responsibility. "I'm going to take you to see someone very special," Marcus continued. "Her name is Mrs. Catherine, and she runs the palace kitchen. She's been here longer than anyone else, and she has the biggest heart in the entire kingdom. But we need to be very quiet and very careful, okay?" Marcus had known Mrs. Catherine since his first day at the palace. She was a motherly woman in her 60s who had raised 5 children of her own while working at the palace for over 30 years. She had an unofficial policy of feeding any guard who looked too thin, any maid who seemed homesick, and any staff member who appeared to be having a difficult day. More importantly, Marcus had heard stories about her helping staff members through personal crises, always quietly and without fanfare. He helped Emma to her feet, noticing how small and fragile she seemed. When was the last time she had eaten a proper meal? Her clothes were clean but worn, and he could see the careful mending that spoke of a mother who had done her best with limited resources. "We're going to walk to the kitchen building," Marcus explained as they began moving along the garden path. "If anyone stops us, you're my niece, and I'm showing you around before my shift ends. Can you remember that?" Emma nodded again, and Marcus was struck by how mature she seemed for such a young child. Life had clearly taught her to be adaptable and cautious. They made their way through the palace grounds, avoiding the main pathways where other guards might be patrolling. Marcus knew the service routes well, the paths that the kitchen staff used to transport supplies and meals between buildings. As they walked, he pointed out different flowers and birds to Emma, trying to keep her calm and distracted. The kitchen building was bustling with activity as the staff prepared for the midday meal. The sound of chopping, stirring, and conversation filled the air. Along with the wonderful aromas of bread baking and soup simmering, Marcus paused outside the main entrance. Taking a deep breath, "Remember," he whispered to Emma, "you're my niece, and you're visiting for just a few minutes." They entered through the service door, and Marcus immediately spotted Mrs. Catherine near the large preparation tables, supervising a group of younger cooks as they worked on what appeared to be an elaborate soup course. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her apron was dusted with flour. She looked up as Marcus approached, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Marcus, my dear boy," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you to my kitchen during the busy hour?" "Mrs. Catherine, I'd like you to meet my niece, Emma," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "She's visiting the palace today." Mrs. Catherine's experienced eyes took in Emma's appearance immediately. The carefully mended dress, the exhausted look around the child's eyes, the way she stayed close to Marcus's side. Mrs. Catherine had seen enough of life to recognize a child in need, regardless of the story being told. "Well, hello there, Emma," Mrs. Catherine said, her voice immediately softening to the tone she reserved for children. "Aren't you a lovely young lady? I bet you've never seen a palace kitchen before, have you?" Emma shook her head, her eyes wide as she took in the enormous ovens, the rows of copper pots, and the bustling activity around them. "Would you like to try some fresh bread?" Mrs. Catherine asked, already reaching for a small loaf that had just come out of the oven. "I just finished baking these, and I always need someone to tell me if they taste right." As Emma accepted the warm bread with both hands, Mrs. Catherine caught Marcus's eye. There was a silent communication between them, the kind that passed between people who had learned to read situations quickly and accurately. She knew there was more to this story than a simple family visit. "Marcus," Mrs. Catherine said casually, "why don't you help me carry some supplies to the pantry? Emma, dear, you can sit right here at this little table and enjoy your bread. We'll be right back." Marcus felt a wave of gratitude toward the older woman. She had understood immediately that something serious was happening, and she was giving him a chance to explain without alarming Emma. In the quiet of the pantry, surrounded by sacks of flour and shelves of preserved goods, Marcus pulled out the note and handed it to Mrs. Catherine. She read it slowly, her expression growing more serious with each word. "Dear Lord," she whispered when she finished. "This poor child. Her mother. I think she may have passed away already," Marcus said quietly. "Emma said her mother brought her to the palace last night and told her she would be watching from heaven." Mrs. Catherine folded the note carefully, her hands trembling slightly. She had seen much heartbreak in her 63 years, but something about this situation touched her deeply. Perhaps it was the desperation in the mother's words, or the trust that a dying woman had placed in complete strangers. "You know what the protocol is?" she said, though her tone suggested she was struggling with the same conflict that Marcus had faced. "I know," Marcus replied. "But Mrs. Catherine should see how the system treats children like Emma. My cousin works for social services in the capital. The orphanages are overcrowded, understaffed. Children get lost in the system, forgotten. This little girl's mother specifically asked that she not end up in one of those places." Mrs. Catherine nodded slowly. She had heard similar stories over the years. Tales of children who disappeared into institutional care and emerged years later, damaged or broken. It was a reality that the comfortable palace life often shielded them from, but it existed nonetheless. "What are you proposing?" she asked, though Marcus could see in her eyes that she already knew. "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted. "I just know that I couldn't hand her over to authorities without at least trying to find another way. Her mother believed that people who served the royal family would help. Maybe we should prove her right." Mrs. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. She thought about her own children, all grown now, with families of their own. She thought about the countless meals she had prepared, the staff members she had comforted, the small acts of kindness that had defined her years at the palace. "The royal family," she said slowly, "they have a private charity fund. It's not well known, but they use it to help staff members and their families during emergencies. Medical bills, educational expenses, that sort of thing." Marcus's eyes lit up with hope. "Do you think they would consider Emma's situation an emergency?" "I think," Mrs. Catherine said carefully, "that the royal family would be very interested to know that a dying mother placed such faith in their household staff. They take the reputation of the palace very seriously, and they believe deeply in protecting children." She paused, glancing toward the door where Emma waited. "But approaching them directly would require going through proper channels, and that means involving security supervisors and administrative staff. Word would get out, and Emma would likely be placed in temporary custody while the request was processed." Marcus felt his hopes deflating, but Mrs. Catherine held up a hand. "However," she continued, "the Queen's personal secretary, Lady Margaret, is a dear friend of mine. We worked together for years before she was promoted. She has the Queen's ear, and more importantly, she has her trust. If anyone could present Emma's situation in a way that would move the royal family to action, it would be Margaret." "Would she help us?" Marcus asked. "Margaret has a soft spot for children in need," Mrs. Catherine replied. "She never married, never had children of her own, but she's sponsored several young people through school over the years. If I explain the situation to her properly, I believe she would at least present it to the Queen." They stood in the pantry, both understanding the magnitude of what they were considering. They were talking about circumventing official protocols, about asking the royal family to intervene in a situation that should rightfully be handled by social services. It was unprecedented, risky, and could cost them their jobs. "There's something else to consider," Mrs. Catherine said softly. "If we do this, if we ask the royal family to help Emma, we're asking them to take responsibility for a child they've never met. That's not something to be requested lightly." Marcus nodded, but his resolve didn't waver. "Mrs. Catherine, what if Emma was your granddaughter? What if she was Lady Margaret's niece?" Would we hesitate then? The older woman smiled sadly. No, we wouldn't. But Marcus, you need to understand that even if Margaret agrees to help, even if the royal family is moved to compassion, there are no guarantees. Emma might still end up in the system we're trying to save her from. Then at least we'll know we tried, Marcus replied. At least we'll know that we honored the faith her mother placed in us. Mrs. Catherine looked through the pantry door at Emma, who was sitting quietly at the small table, carefully eating her bread and watching the kitchen activity with wide, curious eyes. The child seemed remarkably well-behaved for someone who had just lost everything she had ever known. All right, Mrs. Catherine said finally. I'll contact Margaret this afternoon. But Marcus, you need to think about what happens to Emma in the meantime. She can't just disappear into the palace without people asking questions. Marcus had been wrestling with the same problem. I have an idea about that too, he said. But it's going to require one more person's help, and another leap of faith. Mrs. Catherine raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to explain. My landlady, Mrs. Potter, Marcus continued. She's a widow who lives alone in a house too big for one person. She's always saying she misses having children around. If I explained the situation to her, asked her to care for Emma temporarily while we work out a permanent solution. You're asking a lot of people to take significant risks, Mrs. Catherine observed. I know, Marcus said, but sometimes the right thing to do requires taking risks. And I keep thinking about what my grandfather used to say about honor and service. This feels like both. Mrs. Catherine and Marcus returned to the kitchen, where Emma had finished her bread and was watching the cooks with fascination. One of the younger kitchen maids had given her a small cup of warm milk, and she was holding it carefully with both hands. Emma dear, Mrs. Catherine said gently, Marcus is going to take you on a little adventure this afternoon. You're going to meet another friend of ours, a very nice lady, who has a beautiful house with a garden full of flowers. Emma looked up at Marcus questioningly. Will you come too? I'll visit you every day, Marcus promised, his heart aching at the trust in her voice. And Mrs. Catherine will make sure you have plenty of good things to eat. The next few hours passed in careful planning. Mrs. Catherine contacted Lady Margaret through a discreet internal message system, requesting an urgent private meeting regarding a matter of charity that would interest Her Majesty, Lady Margaret. Curious about the unusual request from her old friend, agreed to meet that evening after the regular court business was concluded. Meanwhile, Marcus finished his shift with Emma staying close by his side. He introduced her to several trusted staff members as his visiting niece, and everyone who met her was charmed by her quiet politeness and bright intelligence. It was clear that her mother had raised her well, despite their difficult circumstances. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Marcus and Emma made their way to Mrs. Potter's house, a cozy cottage just outside the palace grounds where several staff members lived. Mrs. Potter was tending to her roses when they arrived, her silver hair glinting in the golden light. Marcus, she called out warmly. What a pleasant surprise. And who is this lovely young lady? Mrs. Potter was 72 years old and had been renting rooms to palace staff for over 20 years. She had a reputation for treating her tenants like family, providing home-cooked meals and motherly advice in equal measure. Marcus had lived in her house for 8 months and had grown genuinely fond of the spirited older woman. Mrs. Potter, this is Emma, Marcus said, his nervousness evident in his voice. I need to tell you something very important, and I need to ask for your help. They sat in Mrs. Potter's garden while Marcus explained the entire situation. He showed her the note, told her about Emma's mother, and shared his plan to seek help from the royal family. Throughout his explanation, Mrs. Potter listened quietly, occasionally glancing at Emma, who was gently petting Mrs. Potter's cat, Whiskers. So this little angel has no one left in the world, Mrs. Potter said when Marcus finished his story. Her voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. And her mother trusted that we would take care of her. I know it's a lot to ask, Marcus began, but Mrs. Potter waved him quiet. Nonsense, she said firmly. Of course, she'll stay here. Look at her, Marcus. She's exhausted, probably frightened, and trying so hard to be brave. No child should have to carry such burdens alone. Emma looked up at the mention of her name, and Mrs. Potter held out her hand. Emma dear, would you like to see my house? I have a lovely room upstairs with a window that looks out over the entire palace, and Whiskers here has been very lonely lately. I think he would enjoy having a young friend to play with." That evening, while Emma was safely settled in Mrs. Potter's spare bedroom, Marcus made his way to Lady Margaret's office in the administrative wing of the palace. His palms were sweating, and he had changed his uniform twice. Wanting to make the best possible impression, Lady Margaret was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence that had served her well in her years of royal service. She had agreed to see Marcus as a personal favor to Mrs. Catherine. Though she had no idea what to expect, "Guard Thompson," she said as Marcus entered her office. "Catherine tells me you have a matter of some urgency to discuss." Marcus had rehearsed his presentation multiple times. But standing in the elegant office surrounded by portraits of past royals, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was attempting. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He told Lady Margaret about finding Emma, about reading her mother's note, about the faith that a dying woman had placed in the palace staff. He explained about Mrs. Potter's temporary care, and Mrs. Catherine's willingness to help, and his own conviction that they had a moral obligation to honor the trust that had been placed in them. When he finished, Lady Margaret sat quietly for several minutes, processing everything she had heard. She had served the royal family for over 20 years and had seen them respond to many requests for help. But this situation was unlike anything that had crossed her desk before. "Guard Thompson," she said finally, "what you're describing is highly irregular. The proper channels exist for a reason, and bypassing them sets a precedent that could complicate future situations." Marcus felt his heart sink. But Lady Margaret continued, however, she said, "I have served this royal family long enough to know their hearts. They believe deeply in protecting children, in honoring the trust that their subjects place in them, and in ensuring that their household staff are people of integrity and compassion." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace grounds where Emma had been found that morning. "I will present this matter to Her Majesty tomorrow morning," Lady Margaret decided. "I cannot predict her response, but I can promise you that she will give it serious consideration. In the meantime, you must understand that if this arrangement is discovered before I can speak with her, there could be serious consequences for everyone involved." Understanding the risk they were all taking. "There's one more thing," Lady Margaret added. "If the Queen agrees to help Emma, it won't be a simple matter of financial assistance. The royal family takes their commitments seriously. This would likely mean ensuring Emma's education, her welfare, possibly even her future career prospects. Are you prepared for that level of involvement in this child's life?" Marcus thought about Emma's trusting eyes, about her mother's desperate note, about his grandfather's stories of honor and service. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I think that's exactly what her mother was hoping for when she brought Emma here." The next morning arrived with unusual tension for Marcus. He had barely slept, his mind cycling through every possible outcome of Lady Margaret's meeting with the Queen, as he took his position in the East Gardens. He found himself glancing repeatedly at the stone bench where he had found Emma less than 24 hours earlier, at Mrs. Potter's house. Emma was experiencing her first full morning in her new temporary home. She had slept deeply for the first time in weeks, exhaustion finally overtaking the anxiety she had carried. Since her mother's condition had worsened, Mrs. Potter had prepared a breakfast of fresh eggs, toast, and jam, delighted to have someone to cook for again. "My dear," Mrs. Potter said as Emma helped clear the breakfast dishes, "you have the most beautiful manners. Your mother raised you very well." Emma's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her mother, but she managed a small smile. "Mama always said that being polite and kind doesn't cost anything, but it's worth everything." Meanwhile, in the Queen's private study, Lady Margaret was presenting Emma's case with careful attention to every detail. The Queen, a woman known for her compassion as well as her wisdom, listened intently to the story of the little girl who had been entrusted to the care of palace staff. "You say the mother specifically mentioned her faith in our household staff?" the Queen asked when Lady Margaret finished her presentation. "Yes, Your Majesty. She believed that people who serve the royal family would show compassion and integrity when faced with a child in need." The Queen was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications. She thought about her own children, about the responsibility that came with power and privilege, about the trust that her subjects placed in the institution of the monarchy. "This young guard," the Queen said finally, "he could have simply followed protocol and handed the child over to authorities. Instead, he chose to honor the mother's faith in us. What do you know about his character?" Lady Margaret had anticipated this question and had spent part of the morning reviewing Marcus's service record and speaking with his supervisors. "He comes from a family with a long tradition of palace service. His grandfather worked in the kitchens for 30 years. His training reports describe him as diligent, honest, and naturally protective. His fellow guards speak highly of his integrity." The Queen nodded thoughtfully. "And this Mrs. Potter, who is caring for the child temporarily?" "A widow who has housed palace staff for over 20 years. She has an excellent reputation and has unofficially helped several young employees through difficult times. Mrs. Catherine vouches for her character completely." "I see," the Queen said. She walked to her window, looking out over the palace grounds where her subjects worked and lived, where they placed their trust in her family's leadership every day. "Lady Margaret," she said finally, "please arrange for me to meet this child. Not in any official capacity, but quietly. I want to see for myself this little girl whose mother had such faith in our people." That afternoon, a carefully orchestrated meeting was arranged. Emma, wearing a clean dress that Mrs. Potter had hastily altered to fit her, was brought to a small private sitting room in the residential wing of the palace. She held Mrs. Potter's hand tightly, uncertain about what was happening, but trusting the kind adults who had taken care of her. The Queen entered the room, dressed simply, without any of the formal regalia that might frighten a young child. She sat down across from Emma and spoke in the same gentle tone she used with her own grandchildren.
"Hello, Emma. I'm very pleased to meet you."
"I hear you've had quite an adventure." Emma, remembering her mother's lessons about politeness, stood and attempted a curtsy. "Thank you for letting me stay in your palace, Your Majesty." The Queen was touched by the child's formal courtesy, despite her obvious nervousness. They talked for nearly an hour about Emma's favorite books, her love of flowers, her memories of her mother. The Queen was struck by Emma's intelligence, her resilience, and the clear evidence of good upbringing despite difficult circumstances. When the meeting ended, the Queen had made her decision. That evening, Marcus was summoned to Lady Margaret's office once again. This time, he found both Lady Margaret and Mrs. Catherine waiting for him, their faces revealing nothing about the outcome of the day's events. "Guard Thompson," Lady Margaret began. "Her Majesty has considered Emma's situation very carefully. She has decided that the faith Emma's mother placed in palace staff should be honored in full."
Ow.
Marcus felt his knees grow weak with relief. "The Queen will personally ensure Emma's education, including university, if she shows aptitude for it. A trust fund will be established for her care and future needs. Mrs. Potter has been asked if she would consider becoming Emma's legal guardian, with full support from the royal household. She has agreed." Marcus couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the generosity and compassion of the response. "There are conditions," Lady Margaret continued. "Emma's situation is to remain private. The Queen does not want this act of charity to become public knowledge, as it might encourage others to abandon children at the palace. You, Mrs. Catherine, and Mrs. Potter will be expected to maintain close involvement in Emma's upbringing, ensuring she grows up with strong values and a sense of responsibility." "Of course," Marcus managed to say, "we would be honored." Mrs. Catherine smiled through tears. "The Queen also said something else, Marcus. She said that Emma's mother was right to believe that people who serve with honor recognize their duty to protect the innocent. She was very impressed by your actions." 1 year later, Marcus stood in the same East Gardens where he had found Emma, the little girl, now thriving under Mrs. Potter's care and excelling in her studies, visited him regularly during his shifts. She had grown taller, her cheeks were fuller, and her eyes sparkled with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved and secure. "Marcus," Emma called out as she ran toward him, her school satchel bouncing on her back. "Mrs. Potter said I could bring you some of the cookies we baked." As Marcus accepted the carefully wrapped cookies, he thought about the note that had started it all. now safely kept in Emma's memory box, along with other mementos of her mother. Emma spoke often about her mama, keeping her memory alive with stories and drawings. But she had also embraced her new life with the resilience that had impressed everyone who met her. "Did you know?" Emma said, settling down on the stone bench where Marcus had first found her, "that Mrs. Potter is teaching me to garden? She says I have natural talent with flowers, just like the palace gardeners." Marcus smiled, remembering how Mr. Thompson had taken Emma under his wing, teaching her about different plants and letting her help with the smaller gardening tasks. The entire palace staff had quietly embraced the little girl, creating an extended family that her mother could never have imagined when she made her desperate decision. And guess what else? Emma continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "Lady Margaret said that when I'm older, if I want to, I might be able to work at the palace too. She said there are many different jobs here, not just being a guard or working in the kitchen. Maybe I could help take care of the books in the library or assist with organizing the charity work that the Queen does." Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction hearing about Emma's bright future. The scared, tearful child he had found had blossomed into a confident, happy girl with unlimited possibilities ahead of her. More importantly, she had grown up surrounded by people who demonstrated daily that service. Honor and compassion were not just words, but principles to live by. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Marcus told her, and Emma's smile grew even brighter as the sun set over the palace gardens. Marcus reflected on how a single moment of choosing compassion over protocol had changed not just Emma's life, but his own as well. He had learned that sometimes the most important decisions were not found in training manuals or regulations, but in the quiet voice of conscience that urged people to do what was right, even when it was difficult. The royal family had kept their word completely. Emma's education was secured, her future bright with possibilities. She had grown up in an environment that valued kindness, integrity, and service to others. But perhaps most importantly, Emma's mother's final act of faith had been validated in the most beautiful way possible. Every day when Marcus passed the stone bench in the East Gardens, he remembered the morning that had taught him the true meaning of honor. It was not about following rules blindly, but about recognizing when those rules needed to be set aside in service of something greater. Emma's mother had been right to believe that people who dedicated their lives to serving others would understand their duty to protect the innocent. And in the years that followed, as Emma grew into a remarkable young woman who embodied all the values her mother had tried to instill in her, Marcus knew that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as ordinary mornings in quiet gardens. When a person faced with an impossible choice simply decided to trust in the power of human kindness. The note that had started it all remained a testament to a mother's love and a stranger's faith, proving that sometimes the most desperate acts of hope could bloom into the most beautiful stories of redemption and grace.